Hey all you DIY philosophers out there in YouTube land, and welcome to this vlog, Wim Wenders, the Berlinale and Gaza. So, I don't know if you've heard about the controversy that was generated when Wim Wenders, the director of the Berlinale for 2026, made certain comments at a press conference, but we'll certainly be going into that in this vlog. The Berlinale is a film festival that shows a lot of different kind of films and not just sort of more mainstream Hollywood type movies. We're going to talk a bit about what was and wasn't said at that press conference, because there were a lot of things that there were questions that were left unanswered. Let's just say that for the moment. But I'm going to be interpreting Wim Wenders as saying that films about the Gaza genocide should not be in the Berlinale Film Festival. Now, Wim Wenders didn't actually say that. So, as a kind of a forward, I'm going to explain why I'm taking the approach that I am. You might be going, what are you on about? Are you just trying to push your own barrow here? Well, the answer is no. And the reason why not is because of the kind of stakes that we confront in this and similar circumstances. So around the world, there has been an attempt to stop, to censor dissent about the Gaza genocide. And that includes in Germany itself. And if you doubt me there, check out the current German Minister for Culture. You might be getting a bit of a weird surprise, and not a very pleasant one. I'm actually shooting this in Queensland, in Australia, and here in Queensland it's actually illegal to utter certain pro-Palestinian phrases. You can be fined and jailed for so doing if you do it in public. So definitely that's the stakes that are being played for, and the reason I'm interpreting Wim Wenders as saying Wim Wenders' remarks as saying that films about the Gaza genocide should be prohibited is because that's exactly how those remarks are going to be used. Do the comments that Wim Wenders made justify the prohibition of film on the Gaza genocide from the Berlinale? Okay, let's hit it. Housekeeping, do some. I'm not going to be using the visual component of the vlog much. I might put up some shots from one or two stills from Wim Wenders movies and maybe some shots of Wim and cohorts. Okay, so what happened was that an unnamed journalist asked a question, prefaced by the observation that the Berlinale had previously been in solidarity with other genocides and oppressions against the committing the genocide and the oppressors. And so why wasn't this the case for Gaza? And we can assume here it's not the case for Gaza, and that assumption didn't seem to get questioned, so we'll go with that. The journalist, I have been unable to find the person's name, and you don't really see an image of this person. That could be deliberate. There's a lot of doxing and intimidation around this issue, so I don't know if that's deliberate or not, but I'll leave it at that. It's just a journalist, that's how this person's described. One thing I want to make a bit clear is that this question was never really directly answered, actually, in the proceedings. What happened was that a tangent went off into this question of politics and film. What Wim Wenders said was that filmmaking is opposed to politics. Now, Wim Wenders stumbled over the word politics a bit when he was initially making this point, and I've since read an interview by another journalist who purports to be one of Wim Wenders' friends, who says that Wim Wenders meant policy. And that puts a much more clearer and charitable interpretation on what Wim Wenders is saying. So I'm going to go with that. I can't find that interview. after this all blew up, of course, like 1 million people put bloody vlogs of the press conference up. Go figure. One says 1 or 2. Why do you need 1 million more? But so as a result, I have been unable to find this interview, and I can't recall the gentleman's name. But I thought it was a good point. So Wenders responded that filmmakers, he used the second person we, have to stay out of politics. And the reason is because we're assuming here we is filmmakers, right? But equally, sort of rubbing your chin and thinking, oh, we is like people who are into artists, perhaps. It's a funny word, isn't it, an artist? Or people into creative expression. Should stay out of politics, and the reason is because we are the counterweight to politics. And so what exactly does that mean? Right. Well, Wenders says that the we here are opposed to politics. That's what he says next. So we're going to try and pull this apart, okay? And one way to start is with Wenders' remark that you're not going to change, and I'm going to revert back to this word policy here because I think it's a really useful word to understand Wenders and to cast him in a charitable light. You're not going to change policy. You're not going to change policymakers by showing them a film. If you showed someone a film about what was happening in Gaza, or you showed someone a film about the destruction of the environment who are policymakers, they're not going to stop doing what they're doing in Gaza, and they're not going to stop destroying the environment. And that seems pretty plausible. So, what can you do? Well, Wim Wenders indicates that you can get people to change how they live, and by looking into themselves. And he opened the press conference by talking about compassion and empathy. And we'll come back to this idea. So one way to understand that, Wenders' position, is to, I'm going to return back to a 2000 interview he gave with the World Socialist website, who are an ultra-left organisation, and it's a really good interview, and a lot becomes clear just because of the uncompromising position of the World Socialist website. So Richard Phillips is still with the WSWS, I believe. The Buena Vista Social Club, which is one of Wim Wenders' most successful films, is about some musicians in Cuba, is a remarkable film by any measure. There have, however, been criticism raised in some quarters claiming that the film abstained on political and historical questions in Cuba. How would you respond to such comments? Wim Wenders: my answer to this sort of comment is to explain that it is much simpler to make a film that is explicitly political. My aim, however, was to make a film that refrained from a political view of Cuba or Havana or these people's lives, and just phenomenologically, philosophy word, ladies and gentlemen, we'll come back to, phenomenologically show it as it was. This, I believe, has a bigger political impact in the long run. So how can that work? Well, if people change, then what they'll put up with and what they'll do, whether it's as soldiers or as functionaries of one kind or another, will change as well. And in the long run, then things will improve, right? We might stop the Gaza genocide. And this is in the long run compared to maybe top-down decision making that changes policy overnight, but it's going to be better policy, change of policy in a better direction than what's going to come from the top. And Wenders references working people, everyday people, as being better, okay, than people who are the administrators or the directors of the system, the theys at the top, right? So we can see how well this suits not just film actually, but other forms of cultural expression as well. In that film is and other forms of cultural expression are ideally situated to allow people to examine themselves inside. Not the big picture of policy where people are genocided or put into public health programs. and you can do one or the other, or both, or whatever. Okay, rather than that, what we're talking about is looking into what people looking into themselves and having compassion. And this can change things. It can change how they behave. And instead of a top-down change, you get a bottom-up change. And the top-down change is impersonal. The bottom-up change is personal and phenomenological. Phenomenology means you're looking at the phenomenon of your own psyche, of your own mind. And we see this happening in the Wim Wenders film, ideally placed to talk about phenomenology, the Wim Wenders film, Wings of Desire, where we have mind-reading angels. And so they're looking both into themselves and into others' psyches and others' phenomenology. In that sense, they're phenomenologists, these angels. Even if kind of practical, hands-on phenomenologists. The idea of telepathy doesn't really change the notion that what we're dealing with here is individuals, incidentally. It's just that if I can mind read you, it's my mind and my psyche, which I need to phenomenologically examine, looking into yours, which then maybe I can phenomenologically examine as well. So what do we find when we look inside the person? Well, when it comes to Wim Wenders, we find quite a lot, and we can start with the sort of limits of phenomenology that Wim Wenders doesn't accept. Okay, so I've got a couple of secondary sources on Wim Wenders, which I'll reference below, and if you read those secondary sources, you'll notice that both of them, understandably, turn to influential phenomenologists in the European tradition to understand Wim Wenders. But as well, both of them refrain from considering Wim Wenders the mouthpiece of this or that phenomenologist. And I think what I've got to say in this vlog will justify that approach, and I don't want to challenge that approach, which I believe is quite widespread. Because it's appealing, because it promises to account for the diversity of Wim Wenders' oeuvre, rather than categorising him as a disciple of one or another thinker. Also, and as well, we can use some of these phenomenologists to understand Wim Wenders, and particularly by seeing how he goes beyond any given influence of this nature. We're going to talk about id-like psychic content. So, phenomenologist is interested in looking inside themselves and seeing what ideas are floating around in there. And some of these are id-like. Now, the reason I use the term id-like is because in psychoanalysis you have this idea of an id, and it's notably antisocial, right? There's other stuff in there as well, but it's notably antisocial. And it's the antisocial content of the id that allows the psychoanalytic tradition to posture a superego which opposes the id, and then the result is an ego, a sort of a subject, right? A psychoanalytic subject, I suppose. We don't need all that. And so I'm not going to say id, I'm just going to say id-like, on the basis, I'm just invoking that idea of notably antisocial content. What kind of antisocial content are we talking about here? Well, it could be like competition understood in a non-playful manner, which is about, oh, I want to kill such and such, or I want to hurt such and such. Okay, so Kierkegaard's got this character that's like a medieval hero. He's a paladin. I mean, it's like a hero knight, like a knight errant or something. And the paladin is brave in the manner of such a hero, and bravely, phenomenologically, examines himself. I'm going to say himself just for historical reasons, not for normative or descriptive reasons. Himself, okay, just because that's the way, as the English translations that I read anyway, that's the way Kierkegaard wrote. Okay, so he looks inside himself and sees this content. And more than that, he recognises that others have this psychic content in them as well, even if they don't have the guts to look inside themselves as the paladin does. The paladin's not only got the guts to see it in himself, he's got the guts to see it, that it's in others, and he's got the guts to say, well, look, I don't care, I'm still going to be a kind of a functioning social unit nonetheless. I'm just not going to kid myself, you know, in the way that non-paladins do, right? Now the Kierkegaardian paladin has a counterpart in the Kierkegaardian bard. And the Kierkegaardian bard, like the paladin, sees the horror, the horror of id-like content in themselves and others, and expresses it. And to the Kierkegaardian paladin, who's required the courage to do this and to confront this stuff, the expressions are like groans. But to others, the expressions are like a sweet song, because they haven't had to actually confront this id-like content. Now, this idea of the Kierkegaardian bard is evident in Wings of Desire with Nick Cave's character. I'm just going to say Nick Cave's character because I think it does actually reflect Nick Cave, at least at some stage. Actually, I think Nick Cave went on and became more Heideggerian, and we'll get to Heidegger. For now, the Nick Cave character is seen in this in Wings of Desire, performing with his band, the Bad Seeds. And the angel looks inside Nick Cave's character, and I'll put a link down to who the Bad Seeds were at this stage, and to the song which is involved, which is called From Her to Eternity. And the angels look inside Nick Cave's character, and Nick Cave's character says, "Oh, I can't wait for this to be over." So, you know, while other people are enjoying it, the audience is enjoying it and getting something out of it. Like, I wish this is over. So it's sort of like sounds like the Kierkegaardian paladin. And then Nick Cave says, in the actual song, he says, "I'm going to tell you about a girl." And Nick Cave goes, "I'm not going to tell you about a girl." But then he goes, "I'm going to tell you about a girl." And that seems to reflect the kind of Kierkegaardian who is finding the experience unpleasant, doesn't really want to do it, but then does it. Why? Because they have to have the courage to do it, and they show themselves that they've got the courage to do it, and that's the only way to live in a way where they can live with themselves, that they you know, kept true to the paladin ideal as a bard by expressing it. And that's how that reads to me. I mean, look, there's multiple ways to read that scene, I guess, but that seems like a pretty good one to me. Now, let's say it's right. Okay, let's say it's right. I think if it's right, then it doesn't mean that Wim Wenders is being Kierkegaard's mouthpiece any more than Nick Cave is Wim Wenders' mouthpiece, right? Well, why would Wim Wenders do that then if Wim Wenders is not Kierkegaardian? And the answer is that Nick Cave, Wim Wenders agrees with Nick Cave's approach, maybe admires Nick Cave's courage in looking in on himself, but he doesn't necessarily find what Nick Cave finds. And why would we think that? Well, the Kierkegaardian view doesn't really shore up even with I don't know, Wings of Desire in its entirety, let alone a film like The Bonavista Social Club, which isn't about characters having id-like content. You know, it's just not about that, and so hence it's not about this Kierkegaardian character. But you know, a lot of rock stars at the time were very shallow, apparently. You know, well they were, right? They were, and I think what Wim Wenders thought was, well, at least Nick Cave's got the guts to do what he does. And to be fair, you know, Nick Cave at least imported humour into it, which you don't really find in Kierkegaard or Heidegger. So I think Nick Cave does add something, okay, and he adds this absurdist humour to it, and possibly Wim Wenders is likes that as well, admires that as well, or agrees with that as an approach as well. Okay, so we move on now to Martin Heidegger. Now, Heidegger is famous for being an official philosopher of the Nazi regime in the 1930s. That's when he started coming to prominence. However, we won't worry too much about that here. Let's just think about how he may or may not be a influence on Wim Wenders. Now, first of all, let's sort of understand a bit about Heidegger. I mean, for our purposes here, I think what's important is an idea that truth is our desire to assert ourselves over others. And I've made a couple of vlogs about this in respect of Nietzsche. But I realised later that I should have talked about Heidegger's reading of Nietzsche, because Heidegger popularised a reading of Nietzsche where the Übermensch was a doctrine of truth, where truth, instead of being objective, is about our desire to assert ourselves over others. So we get an idea of phenomenology where if you look inside yourself, you see a quite competitive subject. And this subject is agonistic, is probably better, considering competition could be playful, or enjoyable in a way that's different from what we can call agonism. So an agonistic subject. And certainly not the case that this kind of subject is particularly present in Wim Wenders' extensive oeuvre. I think that subject is there to some extent. Maybe the protagonist of To the End of the World has moments of that. The female protagonist of that movie is maybe a bit of an Uberwench. I don't really know. I think what's going on here is a bit different. I think that again we have this id-like content, and again we have a introspection that brings out this id-like content. Now in this case it's not so much about bravery, although bravery is incorporated into it, I guess, but more about a purpose. And I think that's what Wenders finds attractive in Heidegger, the idea of a purpose, that when we look inside ourselves, the purpose is, for Heidegger, it's assertion. It's not that for Wenders, but Wenders certainly likes this idea of a directed phenomenology. It's not just about being brave enough to do it. It's not just about being the bard that for you it's groans and for someone else it's sweet song. It's about looking in and finding a driving life purpose, which is a real thing for Heidegger. Now, and that life purpose is competitive, and so it becomes a death purpose as well for Heidegger. Wenders opened the press conference, which we've seen, with the idea of compassion, actually. And compassion doesn't sit very well with Heidegger. And I think that explains why there's not a lot of Heideggerian Übermensch type characters in Wenders' work. Again, I don't think he thinks of it as the way that the exhaustive contents of the psyche revealed under phenomenological investigation. So what does he think? Well, he's kind of closer, I think, to the Surrealists. Now, what the Surrealists did, looked at ideas like they look inside themselves and see ideas like the imagination and ideas about possibility. We've got this idea of a breadth of psychic content. And so Wenders is like the Surrealists in this respect. However, the Surrealists are a bit different to Wenders, and it makes it awkward actually to classify them as phenomenologists. And the reason for this is that they were very influenced by Marx. And let's think about what that means for an idea of an introspective subject, or a subject coming out of introspection. Now, for Karl Marx, the way to explain society, any society, was how they laboured. There is an element of imagination that will shortly come up, so let's not consider this explanation to be mechanical from the outset, because it isn't. What we want to ask is Marx justified in taking this as his point of departure? And the answer seems to be yes, he is. Why is that? Well, the states in which we survive and flourish as human beings are vastly cosmically unlikely. there are a very restricted range of arrangements of atoms, where if you think about the cosmos as a whole, there's a lot more atoms dissipating off into the voids and so on. States like functional tools, nutritious meals, functional garments, functional housing, shelter, they're very unusual states cosmically speaking. And in order for them to exist and to be maintained, you have to put in effort, and that effort is labour. That's because moment by moment, the more common states of the world intrude. Now when we come to labour, human labour, we find some odd things that we don't find elsewhere in the animal kingdoms. And one is that it involves open cooperation. Like, there is cooperation in the animal kingdom, but it's almost exclusively kin-based cooperation. On the other hand, I could just meet a stranger and I could help them fix their car and whatever. And, you know, that might create a good society where if my car's broken down, my push bike, I'll say, I hate cars. You know, someone can help me fix my push bike. And so human beings have learnt to play iterated cooperation games, open-ended cooperation games. And that indicates there's a mental element to labour. Another mental element to labour is the imagination. And that's going to prove very important. Human beings can imagine, build in their imagination what they're creating first. And so I don't know whether animals really have the imagination, but we certainly can say that the imagination manifests itself in a wide range of forms of labour. Whereas when animals, they also have to combat the tendency to the most common and least useful states. And they do that by hunting, by scavenging, by weaving webs, by being parasites. But animals don't have the same range as human beings, and that seems to be a manifestation of the imagination. It's true that spiders live in vast, I mean, spiders are amazing creatures and they live in vastly different biomes. There are some actually high up in the upper atmosphere, but in order to do that, spiders have to take on extreme morphological variants. Well, I mean, it's hard to quantify this sort of stuff, but even then, you know, I mean, think of the incredible range of places that human beings lived and have lived on the moon, in igloos, Indigenous Australians in deserts, in rainforests, in temperate forests, and that's just Indigenous Australians lived in all those biomes. And all across the world there's different biomes in which human beings have lived in different ways. So they can imagine different things. This returns to the surrealists, right? The imagination's important, okay, and it's in there. It's in there as part of the vast panoply of the phenomenological, that's uncovered by phenomenological investigation. Now, I think Wim Wenders wouldn't have a problem with this on face value. I mean, as I've said, I think what he's into is the same idea that there's a lot of different stuff in the human mind. It's not just Kierkegaard, it's not just Heidegger. Right? And I think that he thinks that permits compassion amongst other, raises compassion amongst other possibilities. But the surrealists are on Marx's side. Okay, they think of these possibilities in terms of labour. What the imagination is a way of interacting with the world that is part of the process of labour. And when you think like that, you kind of get a different perspective. And I'll tell you what I mean. So, it's very hard. I don't believe that the human subject is reducible to language. I don't believe the human subject is composed of language. It's a structuralist and a post-structuralist idea, but I don't buy into it. I don't buy that stuff. What I think is that it's hard to disentangle the human subject from language, and when you're engaged in phenomenological investigation, you use language. And it's hard. It would be hard to get rid of language. But I think from a Marx surrealist angle, language is social and it's about labour. It's. I mean, there's a great argument in Wittgenstein, which a guy called Nelson Goodman's taken up, about how you can't have a private language. You need agreement. And if we go back to Marx, well, the agreement is conditioned by how we labour. And I think the surrealists would agree with that. So that means that there's no individual outside of society, just as there's no society outside of individuals. And I think that's where the surrealists and Wim Wenders come apart. I think Wim Wenders thinks that you look inside and you see yourself, and from there you can change society. It's a counterweight to policy, as he says. From there, you can have compassion. One of the best illustrations I've seen of this was in a discussion with Nick Cave, and the discussion was between Nick Cave and a guy called Grant McClellan, who sadly died young. It was in a Brisbane band called the Go-Betweens, and the interview, weirdly enough, was in a gentleman's magazine. I only bought the article, but. And I'll put a link to it. So it was up online. I imagine it still is. And what Grant McClellan says at one point is I'm in here and you're in there, right? And this just seems to be accepted between the two of them, the two friends. That's the case. Okay. And I just insofar as Kierkegaardians have friends, I suppose, and I just think. Look, that does seem right. Of course, it doesn't answer the question of what that I is, but it certainly illustrates the position that of this isolated subjectivity. And on this monadic position, all the different isolated atoms, as it were, or isolated monads, band together and they give us society, right? And society is just explained by all of their different phenomenologies, all in aggregation. There's nothing new there. I don't know if Margaret Thatcher was into phenomenology. Probably, to some extent. I think it's funny how a lot of philosophy is used to underwrite even very conservative politics, but She had popularised at least a saying which was TINS, tins. There is no society. Okay, there is no society. She wanted to be a bit Heideggerian because she thought it was just a bunch of competing individuals. Okay. Now, I think that that's what we get, even if we don't go all the way to Heidegger and Thatcher. What we get is this monad. Monadic view where there's no further truth of the matter about society other than this aggregation. The alternative, it's what Engels calls a transformation of quantity into quality. So once a number of objects, persons exist in certain relations, then we get a new emerging quality, that is the quality of being social. And we get the opposite view, where this quality emerges from relations between individuals and then downwardly exerts a causal influence on those individuals themselves, and you get a sort of a loop, or what's called it's often referred to as a dialectic. It's a more complicated explanation, perhaps, arguably it's more complicated, but if it's explaining a richer phenomena, perhaps so it should be. I think that's the two positions, and they're incompatible in that there is no transformation from quantity into quality and no downwards causation in the Wim Wenders model, as I understand him. And I think this is the only way we can get him to work, to get his explanation to fly. But I think that the surrealists would disagree, and they would say, well, no. They would say, like, language and the imagination is actually social. And mass industrial destruction, such as we find, not just with the devastation of the environment, but also with things like the Gaza genocide, looks like it's a product of capitalism. And again, we're returned to this top-down, the necessity of acknowledging this top-down causal vector, which is the emergent property of capitalism having an effect. And then, of course, again, we have to say, well, look, we can't really rule out things which engage with policy and politics, because we don't just want the bottom-up phenomenological approach. We also want the top-down. We want the maximum riches here, right? We want 1,000 flowers to bloom. We want the top-down. We want to be able to acknowledge and have as open the top content which deals with top-down causal vectors, as I've called them. You might say, well, aren't you just dishing Wim Wenders' oeuvre? But no, I don't really want to do that. Actually, I don't want to dish Wim Wenders' oeuvre. What I want to say is that Wim Wenders at least got it half right, right? Like, Wim Wenders at least recognises the bottom-up causal vectors, and this has enabled him to make some good films. But in respect of his comments at the Berlinale, we also want to recognise top-down causal vectors. Now, some people only recognise bottom-up causal vectors like Wim Wenders, and some only recognise top-down causal vectors. I think Comrade Lenin, maybe, as much as he goes on about the dialectic, maybe only recognised the kind of top-down kind of causal vectors, didn't recognise the bottom-up so much, or at least didn't incorporate them properly into his explanations of society, and instead wound up with a kind of an economic reductionism. Trotsky, I think, was a bit more nuanced, but that's moving into a different area. Okay, so we're going to ask now if the Wenders' account of phenomenology can justify the exclusion of films on the Gaza genocide in the Berlinale. The first thing to note, which it might seem a little bit odd at first, is that policy is bottom up as well on the Wenders' account. Now, previously, the way Wenders talks about policy, it seems to be top down, and you can get that impression, right? It's the artistically motivated, superior and transformative attitudes that are bottom up as people watch good films and listen to good music and so on. That can't be right, really, because remember, on the Wenders' account, everything's bottom up, right? Because tins, there is no society. There is just this aggregate of individuals, so everything has to be bottom up. What Wenders would really have to say about policy is that it's unreconstructed bottom up. It's the policymakers aren't the kind of people who would watch a Wenders film, or would they, listen to Nick Cave and the Bad Seeds or the Go-Betweens or whatever. If they did, they probably wouldn't understand it. So they're not being reconstructed. But if we spread this stuff out through the community more, and we don't make films geared towards policy makers, then we can expect a change, even if it takes longer. And of course, we could say, well, Wenders could say, well, we can try the very hard, and this is where he's talking maybe about things being difficult, the more complex tasks. We can help them understand them, and we can keep making films and keep making music or whatever else that will help these unreconstructed people understand the films. And it also leaves the question of why people have to be reconstructed in the first place unanswered. And so how are we going to answer those questions? Well, I think if you can't answer them top down, like ideology is imposed by the ruling class or some such as that, or that the properties that come out of the emergent property of being social in this day and age, capitalism, affects individuals. If you can't have that, and he can't, then it's got to come from the individual themselves. And what is that? Well, I think what he would have to say would be that when you phenomenologically investigate your own psyche, you look in and you see the good stuff, which gives you compassion, and I don't know about empathy, but compassion. Okay, empathy is weird, but compassion's maybe better. But when you see that stuff, you also can't help but seeing, if you've got guts, and if you're serious about it, you can't help seeing the bad stuff there, the id-like content. We don't necessarily have to describe it as bad and good, but we'll say the id-like content along with the compassion-inducing material. So you see both, right? And so Wenders acknowledges both, and then that gives him an explanation of why some people are unreconstructed, because the human beings are naturally id-like, right? And what has to happen is that art can remedy some, and that others who haven't yet been remedied or reconstructed by film, music, whatever it is, then they're still id-like. And the constant, ongoing, longer-term battle is to save them from their id-like ways. And in this way, film and music and so on becomes a bit like religion, doesn't it? It's like, and this idea of the id-like content becomes a bit like the fall or original sin, right? And just as in the old church days, in the days of Christian religion, it's religion which enables us to overcome the id-like sin. So too, the phenomenologically based creative expressions help us to overcome the id-like content. It would have to be something like that. There's something like that he has to believe. Now, the problem with this is that it runs up against the Marx explanation of id-like content. And what the Marx explanation of id-like content would be that, look, human beings aren't naturally bad or fallen or sinful or id-like, because what they naturally are is cooperators, because naturally they have to labour, and labour is a cooperative endeavour. So then you can say to the person influenced by Marx or the surrealist or whatever, well, you know, what's gone wrong then if human beings are so great? And the answer would be, well, class society, which exerts this downward causal vector, it creates these id-like problems with people, or at least with the expression of id-like content, in such a way that people are destructive and do things like genocide others, right? And that it's awareness of this which is going to help us defeat it. So that includes, as I've said, awareness not only of how we make up society, but of how it makes up us. But for Wenders, that he doesn't want that explanation. He wants that it's built into human beings. And the problem is that without any other kind of explanation, that's religion, right? I mean, it's not just Christianity, but it's Christianity. And Wenders is a Christian. Okay. And then we get a very unfortunate result. We get the unfortunate result that Wenders wants to get rid of content from the Berlinale on the basis of his religious convictions. And that's not right. That's not right. That is not a good reason for getting rid of content from the Berlinale. I don't agree with religion. for sure. But, you know, if Wenders is a religious man and he goes to church, okay, well, other than making atheist vlogs, which I've made and I'll put a link down to them, there's not much I can do about that, right? But his personal religious views should not be foisted on the wider community, much less through a film festival. Now, you might object to this. Well, hang on. It doesn't have to be about religion. I mean, you know, you've said that that Wenders finds id-like content in the human being, and that he could turn to phenomenologists. The problem is that if you go from religion to philosophy, you have to do so in earnest. And what that would look like would be that you would have to have explicit reasons why Kierkegaard and Heidegger or whoever furnished us with the criterion by which you could exclude filmic content from the Berlinale. Okay, and how would you do that? Well, you could have papers or something that you pointed at. But of course, if we're talking in the realm of philosophy, they have to be discussed and debated, because that's what philosophy is about. It doesn't rely on any faith-based leaps. It relies on critical discussion. That's philosophy. It's the difference between philosophy and religion. Right? And you probably need like some sort of panel discussion or something like that. That was an adjunct, perhaps, to the Berlinale. Now, I guess Wenders could go, hey, hang on, it's not a philosophy conference, it's a film festival. Okay, but then, Mr. Wenders, you are using religion to exclude filmic content. You bring it into the domain of philosophy and you're not. Actually, I think the real reason that Wenders wouldn't do this would be because it's not clear how convincing it would be. I mean, especially in Germany, where this stuff's been discussed for a long time, where you've got a long tradition of the discussion of this stuff. You know, good luck with convincing people on some of this stuff, eh? Good bloody luck. And then if you don't, and you still want to exclude the filmic content, bang, you're back to doing it on the basis of your faith, and that's not right. So I'm going to wind up here. I'm going to say that Wim Wenders does not have a good reason to exclude films on the Gaza genocide from the Berlinale, and that he's misusing his faith. And I'm going to say to you that since that press conference, you know, things have gone pretty full on in the Middle East. I mean, at the moment, the tactics they were using on Gaza, the Israelis were using on Gaza, are being used on you know, the talk is of using them, and I've already started doing this. The US has already started doing this of using them on Iran, a nation of 93 million people. Now, things are getting pretty out of control, yeah. And they're threatening to spiral seriously out of control. Right, what we want isn't someone's faith and religion, right? What we want is an analysis of what's causing this, which is capitalism, and the way we labour, which is organised through capitalism, and we want a solution to it. So, you know, get up to speed, Vim. You know, you go to church on Sundays if you want, but let's leave it at home, eh? All right, hope that helped. Let's save the world, folks. Bye for now.